Fuck. Goddamn bitch. My name is David A. Kine, and I am. My name is David A. Kine, and I live in Quebec. I live in the Montreal area. I live on the west side of Montreal. I live in the town of Ville-Perrot, which is situated on the island of Ville-Perrot, which is located almost exactly at the confluence of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers. I'm currently a mature student reading a degree in finance at McGill University. For your information, this recording is being made in the early afternoon of the 26th of May, 2014, in a general purpose or study room, conference room of Macdonald College, which is the West Island satellite campus of McGill University, located in the town of St. Anne de Bellevue. My remarks today, this afternoon, are directed the attention of one Ian Price, who is the county clerk of the village of Oakley, located in Hampshire, England. And my remarks concern a number of persons who were between the early 1920s and the late 1940s or early 1950s resident and domiciled in the village of Oakley. I refer specifically to the context of the written memo of which this audio-video presentation is intended to supplement. Jean Mary McNaught, Jacqueline Robb, otherwise Jacqueline McNaught, Mrs. McNaught, no first name, no first initial, David McNaught, and Mr. McNaught, no first initial. Five persons in total. Three of them are deceased. The individual Mr. McNaught is deceased, has been deceased for many years. The individual Mrs. McNaught is deceased and has been deceased for many years. And the individual Jean Mary McNaught has been deceased since 2009. I'm seeking information with regard to these persons, which may be held even to the present time within the general archive of information, documentation maintained by the village of Oakley. With regard to the two other persons, Jackie Robb, the former Jacqueline McNaught, and McNaught D. David McNaught, as of the date of its sister's death in 2009, Jacqueline Robb was apparently still alive, but its circumstances and situation at the present time are unknown to me. I believe David McNaught is still alive and living in retirement in the city of Peterborough. I'm seeking information specific to, as I stated, the interval during which these persons were domiciled in the village of Oakley, the disposition at the time of their departure or their various departures because they left at different times of the family residence, and its current circumstances, status, and existence at the present time. I'm also seeking information pertinent to any evidence of any aberrant criminal behavior with regard to any of the persons I've referred to, and specifically the individual McNaught Jean Mary McNaught. And for your information, I am the eldest son of Jean Mary McNaught, a fact that I very much regret. In terms of a narrative or family history of these persons, It appears that they were all born in the village of Oakley or in the county hospital. I assume there was a county hospital in Basingstoke, which is very close to Oakley. And they all attended the local primary and secondary school. I assume there was a primary school in Oakley. I assume there was a secondary school in Basingstoke or Basing. But I'm not certain whether any of them graduated. They were all very mediocre students. I don't ever recall ever seeing anything like a leaving certificate or a diploma or a transcript pertinent to the academic history of any of these persons at any time. In terms of their religious affiliation, they appear to have been at least titular members of the local Anglican Church. They were low church Anglicans, so-called. Apparently the local Anglican Church has been demolished within the past several years, and it's been redesignated as a war memorial. The history or the provenance of the family in Oakley, just before these persons were born, is unknown to me. I don't know whether their parents were local residents or whether either of their parents may have had a historical or familial relationship with the village. It's entirely obscure to me. Possibly their parents moved to Oakley at the time of their marriage. Perhaps one or the other of their parents had an association with the village. I don't know where they would have moved from. I would assume it would have been London or the London area. This aspect of the earliest history of these persons is entirely obscure to me, and I'd appreciate any clarification with regard to this aspect of the matter. It would be sincerely appreciated. The father of the family is an individual about whom I know practically nothing. As a small child in Peterborough in the 1960s, 68-69, I recall that my biological female parent showed me a photograph of her father taken, it would appear in the 1920s, possibly in the early 1930s. It was a sepia or studio photograph. It was posed and not spontaneous. The individual in the photograph appeared to be in his late 20s or early mid-30s. Was wearing a gray or a brown tweed suit and had a full head of hair. It didn't wear glasses, or if it did, it wasn't wearing glasses when the photograph was taken. I never saw the photograph since. Its disposition is unknown to me. I would assume, however, that if it does exist, it exists within a general archive of documents that are almost certainly maintained by McNaught D. David. This individual was a commercial traveler, as they're termed in the British Isles, or a traveling salesman, as they're termed in North America. I don't know what product he sold. I think it was life insurance, but I don't know. He probably worked in the London area, or London itself, and so he was probably absent from the family home for several days, or possibly even several weeks at a time. These absences apparently exerted a negative effect upon the marriage, which I believe was probably already under some strain. Eventually the marriage failed. I don't know whether divorce proceedings were ever in fact initiated or concluded. I recall that Jean Mary McNaught told me that as a child, or when I was a child, when she was a child, her father had contracted a relationship which was characterized as a marriage with another woman, probably in the London area, and it even had several children with her. And by the late 1930s, it appears he had left the family home in Oakley to live with his new wife and family. And these developments, I assume, occurred after 1931, which I believe is the year of the birth of the family's last and youngest child, McNaught D. David. This breach apparently was the basis of some degree of financial privation within the family at Oakley, but they continued to live in the family home until the last member of the family, the mother, McNaught X, no first name, who was known to me merely as Nan, left to join her youngest son and daughter in Canada. The failure of the marriage did in addition cause some increasing degree of alienation of the two youngest children towards their father. And it appears, sadly, that they refused to have any further contact with him by the start of the war. In fact, I can't recall one single instance in which either McNaught D. David or McNaught J. Jackie ever referred to their family at all, ever referred to their father at all. And while I don't excuse or minimize the conduct of their father because I know nothing about it in real terms, I consider it very, very sad that the two youngest children became alienated from their father. And whereas I believe that this individual may have been incompetent and irresponsible, I believe that his conduct generally toward his family was motivated by personal weakness and not by any degree of intrinsic malice. It is in fact my belief that the mother of the family very probably alienated the children from their father, possibly to minimize its own degree of responsibility for the failure of the marriage. I will note that the eldest daughter of the family did maintain a relationship with her father and was apparently very upset upon the occasion of his death. This person died, as nearly as I can determine, because again I don't know, sometime between 1950 and 1955, and it was cremated. I remember my mother told me that it was cremated. This may have occurred at Mortlake, which has been the location of a crematorium in the London area for quite some time, but I don't know. As I stated, the mother of the family, it's my belief the mother of the family alienated her children, was least successful in alienating her two youngest children with regard to their attitude towards their father. But nonetheless, whatever problems existed in the marriage, I believe that at least a portion of the responsibility for these unfortunate developments must be attributed to her. And I will note that this person never at any time, in the interval in which I knew it, ever referred to her ex-husband. Notwithstanding the fact that rather pathetically she did refer to herself, and in fact insist upon being referred to and addressed as Mrs. McNaught. The religion of the family was apparently Low Church Anglican, but in general terms they were all agnostics or atheists in terms of their religious orientation, particularly the son and the eldest daughter. And I wonder if they were even ever baptized in the local Anglican church, or if they ever participated in any degree in any of the liturgical or general social activities of the parish. The children also attended the local primary and high school, but apparently appear to have been mediocre students. In fact, I'm not sure whether any of them even earned the equivalent of a high school diploma. And in fact, the distinguishing feature of these persons and their descendants, even with regard to advanced or higher education, is a curious lack of interest and even contempt. Even after they had acquired economic, financial, material, and general and strategic resources that would have been sufficient, and more than sufficient in at least one instance, for them to have pursued a university degree on a part-time basis, they made no effort to improve themselves academically. And in fact, the attitude, or their attitude towards education, appears to have been one that proceeds upon the premise that one acquires only the absolute minimal degree of education that is required in order to allow one to go out and find work. But they would, however, pretend to express a general interest in higher education when they were in the presence of persons such as myself. I have 2 degrees, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, or my father, who was an engineer, whose 2 elder brothers were physicians, and whose younger brother was a physician, an engineer as well, who had acquired a post-secondary education. Certainly, in my opinion, pursuing a graduate degree or a professional degree in engineering, medicine, the law, business, would have exercised no attraction at all for these people. And I would therefore be interested in any information pertinent to the educational history of these persons. And again, I'm not certain whether any of them ever finished their secondary school education, as I noted. My biological female parent, McNaught J.M., stated to me on a number of occasions when I was a child that it was very poor in mathematics and the sciences. And this appears to be a trait that I've inherited. I find mathematics and the sciences either very boring or impenetrable, and I find it very difficult, which is why I have 2 degrees in history and not 2 degrees in mathematics. It also stated that several days before it had to sit what appears to have been a leaving certificate examination or a series of leaving cert examinations, it was tutored for several days by a teacher at the local secondary school. But it never stated that it did in fact successfully complete this examination or this calendar of examinations. And again, I never saw a diploma, I never saw a certificate, I never saw a transcript, I never saw anything pertinent to its secondary school education. Whereas I have copies of all my diplomas, I have copies of most of my transcripts. My educational history is irrefutably well documented, as is my father's. Again, with regard to their secondary education or lack thereof, I doubt whether my mother's younger sister had any great degree of education either. At the time of its marriage to a Canadian serviceman, it was employed somewhere in some capacity, possibly in Basingstoke, possibly in London, probably as a clerk or a sales girl. And the youngest member of the family, David, was also working as a clerk at a facility that may have sold coal, checking delivery vehicles in and out of the coal yard. And it was at that time only 16 years of age. And at the time of its emigration to the Canadian Dominion, which occurred a year after its sister's marriage and emigration, 1946, 1947 respectively, it was only 17 years of age. And I'd appreciate any information which those who will view this video may have with regard to this element of the personal history of these persons. In the mid-1940s, the family at Oakley began to dissolve. The eldest daughter, my biological female parent, appears to have left for London. And after that, for the next several years, in fact, it appears to have drifted about from London back to Oakley. I think it probably lived in Winchester, which isn't that far from Oakley, for a while. And while in London, it appears to have lived in various rooming houses, which were very common in London at that time. And they still, to this day, remain a feature of the, what might term, underclass London social landscape, and catered to a clientele that at that time was primarily, if not exclusively, homosexual. It may also have lived with various women during this interval, and I believe it did, all of whom would either have been homosexual or bisexual. But in general terms, the personal history of this person, my so-called mother, between 1944 and 1961 is almost entirely obscure to me, even to the present day. At the end of the war, as I stated, the middle daughter met a Canadian serviceman, a driver and mechanic in the motor corps, one Rob TV, or Trevor Vernon Rob, presumably, who was originally from the country, proximate to the town or village, as it was at that time, I would assume, of Campbellford, Ontario, which is located about 20 or 25 miles due east of Peterborough, Ontario, on Highway 7. They were married in 1946, they returned to Canada the same year, and their first child, Rob W. William, Billy Rob, was born the following year. They had a total of 4 children, 3 of whom were girls. All are still alive at the date of this audio-video presentation. And after marriage, the couple settled in Peterborough, Ontario, located approximately 80 miles east-northeast of metropolitan Toronto. Rob T. Trevor worked as a self-employed mechanic. He worked briefly as a car salesman, trying to sell Renault automobiles, and it finished its career teaching auto mechanics at the local community college, or Polytechnic, Sir Sandford Fleming College. And it died upon or about the 2nd day of May, 1998. As of the 9th of February, 2009, which was the date of my mother's funeral, its sister, Rob J. Jacqueline, was still alive, but may be deceased at the present time. The youngest child, McNaught D. David, emigrated to the Canadian Dominion the following year, and also settled initially in Peterborough. A position was found for it at the local Bank of Montreal, and it worked for this institution in various places, including Europe, until its retirement in May of '93. It currently has an address in Peterborough at 544 Forti Avenue, and it's apparently still alive, again, at the date of the composition of this audio-video presentation. It never married, never had any close relationship with any woman apart from its mother, and it's my opinion and belief that McNaught D. is a lifelong, deeply closeted homosexual pervert and possibly a pedophile as well. The mother of the family, otherwise known as Nan, also immigrated to Canada, but the date of its departure from the UK is unknown to me. But it was living in the city of Lindsay, Ontario, which is a slightly smaller urban center, about 25 miles west of Peterborough, about 1952, because its son had been appointed or named as manager of the Bank of Montreal in that locality. And I would assume that it emigrated sometime between 1949 and 1951, but I don't know. The eldest daughter, who, as I stated, left the family home source in 1944, before the end of the war, also immigrated to Canada and to Peterborough in 1950-51. It had applied for a position with a boys' private boarding school, known as Lakefield College School, known as the Grove, now known as LCS, located at the eastern periphery of the village of Lakefield, which is a small, literally a small village. At that time, I think only 1,100 people. I think there's 3,000 or 4,000 people there now. 7 miles northeast of the city of Peterborough. And for your information, this is the same school to which Prince Andrew was sent for one term in 1978. It was engaged in the capacity of junior matron, whatever that is, and it sang in the school choir. But it only remained 1 year and returned to England in 1952. It did, however, return to the Canadian Dominion in 1957, settled in Montreal, lived there from 1957 to 1968. It removed its domicile back to Peterborough in 1968 and remained there for the rest of its life, dying, as I stated, in February of 2009 of complications consequent to Alzheimer's illness. It was a lifelong agnostic atheist and a lifelong lesbian, homosexual, pervert, and psychopath. It was cremated. The disposition of its ashes is unknown to the respondent. They may have been interred or deposited or scattered somewhere, either in the United Kingdom or in the Canadian Dominion. Post the departure of these 4 persons from Oakley, none of them ever returned. Nor did any of them ever reestablish permanent or even temporary domicile in the village, with the exception of David McNaught, who at least one occasion in the early 70s did visit Oakley as part of a motor tour excursion, which I believe it took with its mother that year, or 1973, 1974. And I'm curious to know the disposition of the family residence. It was never stated definitively that the property was sold. It does appear, however, that one day the mother of the family, who was at that time there, by that time there all by herself, simply packed a bag and left. If the property had been sold, even if the property had been entailed with debt, there would have been at least some funds remaining after the creditors were paid. But apparently when the mother of these persons arrived in Canada, it was almost entirely without resources, and in fact worked for a family in Peterborough, the Kellys, for several years as a housekeeper and nanny. The Kellys were a family of some wealth and means. They sold fuel oil, and my father, when he rented a house in Peterborough, initially on Charlotte Street, when he owned a house in Peterborough on Albertus Avenue, bought his fuel from Kelly's Fuel Oil. So upon these bases, I would appreciate being apprehended with regard to the disposition of the family residence post-1949, 1950. I have a number of questions. Was the property sold? Did the mother of the family simply walk away from the property? Was the property seized by creditors? Was it seized by the county for unpaid property tax? Did the mother of the family leave because it wanted to, or did it leave because it had to? Because the property had been ceded to a receiver. And again, I'd appreciate any information pertinent to the disposition of the family residence at the end of the 1950s. With regard to the property itself, I recall a slideshow given by David McNaught, whose avocation was photography, taken of the property and other sites around the village of Oakley, such as the school, the pond, in the early 1970s. And there's at least one slide, I recall at least one slide of the family property, which still existed at that date. I recall that the photo was not clear because the house itself was obscured by trees. It looks like the photograph had been taken through some trees. And it appears that the property stood along the top of a recessed roadway or laneway. And it appears that the house, in order to gain access of the house, one had to negotiate a flight of steps from the road. It appears to have been a large house by British Isles standards, with 3 or 4 bedrooms. I suppose it had to have been that large because there were 2 adults and 3 children, so you would have had 2 of them were girls, so one would have required at least a 3-bedroom residence. It also appeared to have had 2 stories. I recall that my mother told me that it and its brother and sister used to play in the attic, so it seems to have had a rather substantial attic story. It was built either of white stone or white stucco and plaster. At the time the photograph was taken of the property, it seemed to be inhabited and in a good state of repair. Again, circa 1973, 1974. I'd appreciate being apprehended of where it is in relation to the village. The family were part of Oakley Village per se, but apparently they didn't live in the town. It seems that they lived some distance beyond Oakley, perhaps as much as a distance of 1 mile. If it's possible to view the property per Google Street View, I must assume that Google has probably passed through Oakley by this time. I'd appreciate being made aware of whether this is possible. The matter of the circumstances of the eldest daughter of the family is a matter of, or an element of greatest significance to me, nonobstant the references to other aspects of the matter that have been adumbrated supra. As I noted momentarily ago, within the context of my memo, this person, McNaught J.M., Jean Mary McNaught, my so-called mother, biological female parent, was a lifelong, deeply closeted lesbian homosexual pervert, and it is practically a certainty that its lifelong history of homosexual behavior began in Oakley, or possibly in the nearby town or city of Basingstoke. Upon these bases, I would be interested to know whether there is any evidence in the archive of general files kept by Oakley Village, or perhaps in police files in the area, that imply, suggest, or confirm that this person was a homosexual pervert, and any information pertinent to this information would be sincerely appreciated. 1910. Subsequent to, I stated that none of these people had any great degree of education, and none of them appears to even have earned a high school diploma. However, after my mother moved to Peterborough, after we moved from Montreal to Peterborough, my mother obtained what I would term a quasi-teaching certificate, circa 1970, which qualified it to teach, pardon me, as a teacher librarian within the Peterborough Public School Board. And at that time, there was a building which is now which has been co-opted, pardon me, as part of the ever-expanding bureaucracy of the Peterborough Public School Board, which was known as a normal school, which issued teaching certificates before everything was centralized at a number of so-called faculties of education at York, U of T, University of Toronto, Queen's in Kingston, the University of Ottawa, and Carleton University, also in Ottawa. And it taught in the Peterborough County Board of Educational System until its retirement, which occurred very hastily due to certain revelations that I made about its personal behavior in 1985. I stated that my mother was tutored just before graduation, if it ever did graduate, by one of its former teachers. And I believe that this person may have in fact have been one of my mother's first or primary sexual partners. And if this person, and this person is of course long dead by now, but certainly the teaching profession has been an occupation which has tended to attract homosexual perverts of both sexes for many years. My mother was a homosexual pervert and was a teacher. Additionally, I believe that my mother may also have frequented and loitered in the vicinity of a number of military installations, of which there were several apparently close to the village of Oakley. And I recall my mother making reference to the NAFI van, which was a mobile tea shop or caravan, which sold tea and buns as well as coffee and cigarettes after the Americans arrived between 1939 and 1945. In addition to these NAFI vans, there was also the wartime phenomena of the NAFI dances, which were staged regularly across England, again between the dates 1940 and 1945. However, nonobstant their original purpose, which was to provide an occasion and opportunity for British and Allied aircrew to divert themselves between operations, they degenerated, particularly in the south and west of England, the London area, into places and opportunities of resort for a lesbian homosexual clientele. In fact, certain NAFIs were, pertinent to the area in which they were situated, considered to be events reserved almost exclusively for a lesbian bisexual clientele. And such persons were either on active service as members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or they were females engaged upon rear echelon, low-level, non-operational, non-competent duties as clerks and secretaries. It is my belief and conviction, therefore, that McNaught J.M., my biological female parent, was a regular attendant and habitué of these predominantly lesbian-oriented NAFI dances, and that its career as a lifelong lesbian homosexual pervert began at these events. Upon these bases, therefore, I would appreciate being apprehended of the location of these various NAFI dances as they were staged in the vicinity of the village of Oakley during the war, as well as information with regard to how regularly they were held. Certainly it is my absolute belief and conviction that McNaught J. did frequent and did loiter in the vicinity of the NAFI vans and the NAFI dances, held in the area immediate to or intermediate to Oakley Village, in order to make contact with lesbian homosexual perverts who were engaged upon national service.